There I am. So our first speaker is actually a repeat from last year. He gave a really good talk, a different talk last year. So if you want to see a second talk by our first speaker, you can go to the website for Bootcamp last year. But Harald Atmanspacher is an emeritus member of the Turing Center at ETH in Zurich, in Switzerland. He's a theoretical physicist with more than 3 decades of experience in interdisciplinary research. And he is known for his work on complex dynamical systems, non-reductive approaches in the philosophy of science, foundational questions of quantum theory, and this is what he talked on last time, non-commutative, commutative structures in physics and cognition. And regarding today, he's also one of the principal architects of a systematic and coherent account of mind-matter relations called dual aspect monism, which is what he'll be talking about today. And I just want to point out that long before I knew Harald, as I was working on my book, and this would have been 2010, 2011, 2012, I surveyed a lot of different approaches to quantum theory and the mind-matter problem, because that was central to the book. And I ended up being attracted to Harald's framework in particular. And if you read chapter 6 of my book, it's like a condensed version of his, sort of a lot of his work with his colleague, co-author Hans Primus. And so that's just amazing stuff. I was very attracted to Harald's framework because it's a unified and coherent framework. And it has quantum, it has subjectivity, and it has temporality. And it's all unified in a very aesthetically pleasing way. So I'm very excited to actually hear this presentation, because I probably believe it already, having studied Harald's work at some length. So I think I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Harald. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. And probably there will be even more to it. In addition to subjectivity, temporality, and physics, there will be something more. Now, technically, I have to share the screen, right? Is that true? Right.
Yes, please.
Okay. Oh my goodness. This is the one. Okay, and now put it this way. No. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, now, so what I want to do today is present some of the essential lines of thinking of a new book, which I published together with Dean Rickles. I show you the book here. It has a title which is very close to the title of this presentation. The title of the book is Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Meaning. And this is exactly what I want to introduce in this talk. I want to introduce this metaphysical framework for the mind-body problem, which is called dual aspect monism. And then in step 2, I want to talk about the role that notions of meaning play in this metaphysical framework. And at the end also have some kind of empirical results which support the whole model together with these notions of meaning. So that's the rough overview. Dual aspect monism is a reaction to another philosophical framework to talk about the mind-matter problem, and that's René Descartes' framework, which he came up with in the 1630s and 40s, which is now called interactive dualism. It's a kind of substance dualism which claims, or which posits, I should say, that all of nature decomposes into 2 parts. One of them is the mental and the other one is the physical. So the mental would include things like cognition, affects, consciousness. So the mental is just a kind of container notion for everything that's not physical. And then of course we have the physical, and that's for Descartes, everything that's not mental. Descartes had, of course, different notions for these 2 domains. He called them, in good Latin tradition, he called them res cogitans, that would be the mental domain, and res extensa, the extended domain, that's everything that's extended in space, and that would be the material domain. Now, there have been several reactions to Descartes' dualism, and the most prominent ones during the history of ideas have been idealism and physicalism. And these are not dualisms, these are attempts toward monisms, because the idealist would like to say, or would like to claim, or would like to look for options to reduce everything that is material to something that is mental. That would be a kind of subjective idealism like Fichte or others. And then the other reaction, which amounts to another monism, is physicalism. And physicalists, which are still populating the theory of the mind-matter problem today, physicalists would try to argue that actually what you need to understand is the physical world, and somehow then this will also explain consciousness, the mental, and so on and so on. So dual aspect monism is a reaction to Descartes' interactive dualism, but it also avoids both physicalist and idealist leanings. So it's a kind of fourth option. The philosophical pioneers of dual aspect monism are Spinoza in his Ethics, 1677, published posthumously, and also, believe it or not, Schelling in his Freedom essay of 1809. Schelling is usually in many textbooks and encyclopedias, he is listed as one of the German idealists, but he was only an idealist in the really first part of his works. And already in the early 19th century, he turned away and followed Spinoza, actually, and modified Spinoza's system here and there, but essentially Schelling today must be considered one of the first dual aspect monists. Then we go to the turn of the 20th century, and we have three very prominent dual aspect monists: Ernst Mach, William James, and Bertrand Russell. And Russell coined the notion of neutral monism for dual aspect monism, and we will see why that is so. And another class of dual aspect monists, in addition to the neutral monists, are the names that you see on this slide, on the lower side of this slide. These are quantum-inspired versions of dual aspect monism. And the names that you see are Wolfgang Pauli, Carl Gustav Jung. This couple is the couple that I have studied a lot with Hans Primas, which that's the work that Alex mentioned in the beginning. Then there is another couple, Arthur Eddington and John Wheeler. John Wheeler, one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. And third, David Bohm and Basil Hiley. And again, for details on all this historical development and also the three quantum-inspired versions of dual aspect monism, you can have a look into this book by myself and Dean Rickles, a close friend and colleague from the University of Sydney. Now, let me again say a little bit more about the difference between neutral monism and the quantum-inspired versions of dual aspect monism. Neutral monism posits that there are psychophysically neutral elements, which means elements that are neither mental nor physical. So there is a third domain introduced here. They are psychophysically neutral, and they are elements which can be composed in different ways. And depending on how you compose them, the composition, the configuration that you come up with, either leads to mental or to physical properties. So in a way, the mental and the physical can be reduced to the psychophysically neutral elements. And this whole story is in some way inspired by classical system theory, where you have parts, you put them together and get wholes, right? Mach, Ernst Mach, William James, Bertrand Russell are the pioneers. And I show you a quote by Bertrand Russell here from the Analysis of Matter in 1921. On the one hand, many psychologists, that's 1921, many psychologists, originally those of the behaviorist school, tend to adopt what is essentially a materialist position as a matter of method, if not of metaphysics. They make psychology increasingly dependent on physiology and external observation, and tend to think of matter as something much more solid and indubitable than mind. Meanwhile, the physicists, especially Einstein and other exponents of the theory of relativity, 1921, in brackets, 1921 was before quantum theory got developed, really. So Einstein and other exponents of the theory of relativity have been making matter less and less material. Whoever reads, for example, Professor Eddington's Space-Time and Gravitation will see that an old-fashioned materialism can receive no support from modern physics, it says, in 1921. The view that seems to me to reconcile the materialistic tendency of psychology with the anti-materialistic tendency of physics is the view of William James and the American New Realists, according to which the stuff of the world, the ontology, so to speak, is neither mental nor material, but a neutral stuff out of which both are constructed. The stuff of which our experience is composed is, in my belief, neither mind nor matter, but something more primitive than either. Both mind and matter seem to be composite, and the stuff of which they are compounded lies, in a sense, between the two, in a sense, above them both, like a common ancestor. So I think this expresses very nicely the situation at the time when Russell was writing this book, The Analysis of Matter, and also the way he thought, which we should develop our metaphysical thinking in order to come up with a kind of viable solution to the mind-matter problem. Now, the other mode of dual aspect thinking is the one that I mentioned before as being inspired by quantum holism or by quantum theory. In this other mode, there's also a kind of psychophysically neutral domain, but it's not understood in terms of elements, but it's understood ultimately as one psychophysically neutral whole, an undivided universe, so to speak, but not the physical universe, but the physical universe would be physical, but this whole is neither mental nor physical, again, but it's a whole, it's not elements. So the way these people thought was a psychophysically neutral whole gets decomposed into the material, into the mental and the physical. And this idea, of course, is not reductive because you cannot reduce parts to wholes. That, at least this is not the usual understanding of reduction. And of course, this is inspired by quantum holism, because here we have this notion of wholes that have to be decomposed in order to get empirically accessible, and so on and so on. And as I mentioned before, Pauli Jung, Eddington, Wheeler, Bohm, and Haile are the major exponents of this way of thinking. Here you have photographs of all these guys. You all know them. This is Wolfgang Pauli here. This is Carl Jung. By the way, this is an interesting couple because Pauli is a physicist, or was, and Jung was a psychologist. So even in their backgrounds, you see the mind-matter problem constellated somehow. This is Arthur Eddington. This is John Wheeler. This is a picture of David Bohm, and this is Basil Haile, the only one of these six who is still living and working very effectively, a very bright mind. Now, this is a sketch, a very cursory sketch of how you could imagine this kind of threefold structure of dual aspect thinking. You have the mental domain, conscious states, mental states, and you have the physical domain. And if this were all, then you would be back to Descartes, right? This would be a kind of ontological dualism. But in dual aspect thinking, the physical and the mental they are not part of the ontology of the framework. The ontology is this. So this is the undivided base reality. There are, in the terminology of Jung and Pauli, there are archetypal patterns. In David Bohm's terminology, this would be the implicate order. And of course, when you listen to Jung, then always the collective unconscious plays a role, and so on and so on. So you see the domain below the horizontal line, that's the ontology. That's the neither mental nor physical. And the two domains above the horizontal line, these are epistemic domains which come up by decomposition of the ontological domain, of the undivided domain. I also want to give you a nice quote here, which is in a way very similar to the Russell quote, but it's from 1954, so it's about 30 some years later by Wolfgang Pauli. And Pauli says, on the one hand, the unconscious can only be made accessible in an indirect way by its ordering influence on conscious contents. On the other hand, every observation of the unconscious, that is every attempt to make unconscious contents conscious, has a prima facie uncontrollable reaction back onto these unconscious contents themselves, as is well known. This precludes that the unconscious can be exhaustively brought to consciousness. There's always something remaining unconscious, different from Freud's theory, by the way. The physicist will, per analogy, conclude that precisely this uncontrollable backlash of the observing subject onto the unconscious limits the objective character of its reality and at the same time provides it with some subjectivity. The development of microphysics has unmistakably led to a remarkable convergence of its description of nature with that of the new psychology, Jungian psychology, he means here, while the former, due to the fundamental situation known as complementarity, faces the impossibility to eliminate actions of observers by determinable corrections and must therefore in principle relinquish the objective registration of all physical phenomena. The latter could basically complement the merely subjective psychology of consciousness by postulating the existence of an unconscious of largely objective reality, ontology, really. Now, this is very dense, as you notice probably. I will not read it a second time because you can see it in the slides that you can find on the Ohio State University website, or the Bootcamp website. And I just want to tell you what this quote means in terms of this kind of figure here. So one thing is that the archetypal patterns, when they're activated, they orchestrate what happens in the mental domain and in the physical domain. But this whole issue of back reaction means that there's a two-way traffic between these domains. It's not only from here to here, but it's also from here down there and from here down there. This way would be the uncontrollable back reaction in physical, in quantum measurements, right? Uncontrollable. And this would be the back reaction of consciousness into the unconscious, which is the whole point of psychoanalysis anyway. I mean, if there would be no back reaction from here to here, then nothing would change the unconscious. And that's actually the claim of the psychoanalysts, that they, in psychoanalysis and therapy, that they can improve the state of unconscious problems and whatever. I'm not talking about this today. So we have a two-way traffic upward and downward in this picture. So there's a kind of coupling, an epistemic ontic coupling, which is built into this metaphysical framework of dual aspect monism. Now in the next slide, I show you I list some key features, which I actually mentioned already, but here they are listed in a kind of survey fashion. The unus mundus, the one undivided world, is a basic level of a psychophysically neutral domain without distinctions such as mind, matter, subject, object, self-world, and what have you. The mental and physical systems emerge as dual epistemic aspects due to a partitioning or symmetry breaking, you could say, of the holistic psychophysically neutral domain. Then there are archetypal patterns. That's Jung's notion of archetypes. Of course, this is not. This has not been created by Jung. It's a very old notion, which goes back to Plato and others. Archetypal patterns provide a hierarchy of psychophysically neutral order elements between the unus mundus, which would be the lowest level, completely undivided, and the mental and physical aspects. So archetypes mediate between the totally undivided universe and the dual aspects. Then psychophysical correlations reflect the lost holism of the psychophysically neutral. So whenever an archetype orchestrates something in the mental and in the physical, then it also orchestrates correlations between these. And these are the psychophysical correlations. Jung called them, some of them synchronicities. And we have a much more general theory about these psychophysical correlations, as you will see. Now, whenever you see correlations in science, or it doesn't matter whether it's cognitive science or psychology or physics or biology, whenever you see correlations, what you want to do is you want to understand where they come from. And so the scientific reflex almost is look for causal substantiations. So look for some kind of cause and effect relations, which are the cause of the correlations. Now, psychophysical correlations are correlations between the physical and the mental. So there's no way to talk about causation in the usual sense. Science talks about causation, efficient causation. Efficient causation has to have a cause, which is in the past of the effect. And the correlations between the mental and the physical are not diachronic. There is no temporal relation between them. So there cannot be causation in the usual sense. So they cannot be, so psychophysical correlations, this is the upshot of what I'm saying, can not be explained causally. And of course, this is a critical point. They are assumed not to be by chance. Of course, sometimes they are by chance, and this has to be excluded somehow. And now the great idea of Carl Jung, Wolfgang Pauli, Arthur Eddington, John Wheeler, David Bohm, and Basil Hiley was to find another kind of substantiation of these correlations. And that's what they found was the notion of meaning. I will say more about that. So psychophysical correlations, to substantiate them in terms of meaning, means that you look for a relation between a mental state and a physical state that are coupled by a kind of reference relation. And as I said, I will say more about that to explain that in more detail. And meaning is of course not the same as syntactic information. Meaning is not grammar or something or style or whatever. Meaning is really semantics. It's not syntax. So meaning in the sense of semantics is posed as a basic relational ingredient of the fabric of reality in dual aspect monism. And you will see shortly how I think about this. Now, the next slide, this one and the next slides, actually the next two slides, let's see how late it is, okay. The next slides are intended to show you how this whole framework of thinking really can be considered in analogy to basic concepts that we use in quantum mechanics. And I want to introduce the notion of a pullback metaphor here. That's a notion that has been coined by a mathematician from Stanford, Keith Devlin. And he says the following: if a largely unknown situation is considered in structural analogy to a well-understood situation, this is called a pullback metaphor. Here, in our case, we consider particular suitable features of quantum theory as a pullback metaphor for the mind-matter problem. Quantum theory, well understood. Quantum theory is not miracle, it's not paradoxical, it's really well understood today. And the largely unknown situation, the largely non-understood situation is the mind-matter problem in this case. In particular important for using decomposition, using a pullback metaphor, or using quantum mechanics as a pullback metaphor for decompositional dual aspect monism is quantum entanglement. And I'll show you how this works. Let me start with the bipartite version in quantum entanglement. So what you see here, I hope you can see my cursor. This is the quantum mechanical notation for an entangled state. It's important that this entangled state, psi entangled, cannot be written as a product. So we say this is not a product state, it's an entangled state. You can disentangle it into psi1 and psi2 separately, like here. And then as a result, you get a-causal correlations. These are the quantum correlations, quantum mechanical correlations. This would be By the way, this could be a Bell state, and then you have in the typical Bell experiments, you get psi2 and psi1 separate states, and they are correlated by quantum correlations. The correlations that, as you know, from Bell inequalities and etc., all this kind of stuff, that you know violate the limit of 2 in the Clauser-Horn-Shimoni-Hort inequality, and they can go up to 2 times square root 2, so they violate the Bell limit, or the Bell limit. And these correlations can, of course, be tested statistically in a very sound manner, and there are now, I don't know, thousands of experiments which really have shown that these correlations exist, and also that they must be acausal. So when you measure something here and you measure something here, you can design the experiment in such a way that the measurement of psi2 is outside the light cone of psi1. So you know there can be no causal correlation. Now, this is one side of the pullback metaphor. And this is the other one. This is the known territory. This is the unknown territory. Now here we have the psychophysically neutral domain, which would be analogous, or metaphorically analogous, to the entangled state. And rather than psi1 and psi2, we have the mental and the physical here. And we also posit that there are acausal correlations, the psychophysical correlations between the two. And now, of course, when we have mental physical correlations, it gets very difficult to look at them in a statistical way. Statistics usually doesn't lead us anywhere in this case. But we can, according to the proposal that was made by the people I mentioned before, we can try to talk about meaning. Like a mental representation always has an intentional content, and the intentional content is the reference to something in the physical world. So the mental representation represents something physical. That would be the notion of reference relation. And those of you who know the history of the philosophy of mind a little more than Franz Brentano in 1873 in his famous book on psychology from an empirical point of view, he called this intentionality. Brentano's notion of intentionality is meaning, and it features in the philosophy of mind term intentional content of mental representations. Now, this is the bipartite version of the pullback metaphor. There's also a tripartite version, because what we can do is we can look at the full picture of dual aspect monism with the mental, the physical, and the psychophysically neutral in one set, right? Not like you saw here. Here would be the entangled state, here would be the psychophysically neutral, and then we look into a bipartite decomposition. What we do now is we look into the tripartite version, and the tripartite version has 3 vertices, if you want, MP and the psychophysically neutral. And now we have we have 3 kinds of pair correlations, sigma 1, sigma 2, and sigma 3. And we even have a 3 correlation, which is here indicated by rho, a correlation between all 3 of them at the same time. Now we have two basic decomposition classes, not only one. In the Bell state, we have only one. But here we have 2. We have a situation in which all these 3, MP and PPN, are correlated with one another. And once we trace out one of them, PPN, P or M, so we isolate one of them, then all the others are traced out again, are traced out as well. So a decomposition of M and P from a GHZ-like kind of state always ends up in 3 isolated states. Now the W-like decomposition is different. We also have this kind of overall correlation, but we can set it up in such a way that we always get a pair correlation plus 1 isolated element. Like you can isolate the physical, then these remain correlated. You can isolate the mental, then these remain correlated. You can isolate PPN, and these remain correlated. by the way, this leads us back, the third option here leads us back to the bipartite version that I discussed on the last slide, on the preceding slide, right? So we have different kinds of decomposition classes here. Now the correlations, sigma 1, sigma 2, and sigma 3 can now, and also rho, can now be substantiated according to the proposal of our pioneers in terms of different notions of meaning. And one notion of meaning that I indicated already is the notion of reference. That would be what we have here, the correlation between M and P. Mental representation represents something in P, right? That would be sigma 1. That's what we call surface structure, as you can see here. And that's what Brentano and other philosophers, current philosophers like Thomas Metzinger, call intentionality or reference. Now, then we also have a kind of deep structure. We have the mental, the physical, and we have something which is below the horizontal line, if you want, below them, which is their common ground, the psychophysically neutral. So we have sigma 2 as, and sigma 3 as a kind of deep structure of meaning, which connects the psychophysically neutral with the mental and with the physical. And this is what another philosopher at the end of the 19th century, Gottlob Frege, called sense. He wrote this famous paper on sense and reference, and he made exactly the difference between surface structure and deep structure that we are trying to exploit here, right? And the triple correlations are the correlations of the composite system that contains all three domains, right? M, P, and PPN. So that's the tripartite version. Now, deep correlations, that would be sigma 2 and sigma 3. Sigma 2 would be the correlations between, as you can see here, between psychophysical neutrality and M. And these would be, in Jung's terminology, this would be a kind of first stage conjunctio, he calls it the unio mentalis. This is something, this is a kind of sensible correlation that connects conscious mental images with their unconscious origin. So this stipulates that there is a relation between the unconscious and the conscious and consciousness, which is, you know, for instance, explaining something like having insight experiences. Deleuze called it immanent experience, for those of you who are interested in more philosophy on this. And Spinoza, one of the pioneers, actually called this intellectual intuition, the deepest and highest, I should actually say, highest form of knowledge that can be achieved for humans, intellectual intuition. This is not intellectual in the sense of what we now call intellect. It's much deeper. Now that would be sigma 2. Let's see. You see, that would be this kind of correlation. Now, let's look at this kind of correlation. That would be between the psychophysically neutral and P. And here we can look at the psychophysically neutral in terms of mathematical structures. For instance, the mathematical Platonist would immediately say that that everything that mathematicians can discover is something in the psychophysically neutral. Mathematics does not tell you whether it wants to be applied in the mental or in the physical. It's neutral with respect to the mental and physical. So this can be related to Pauli's insistence that structures of the physical world are the physical manifestations of archetypes. So whatever you see in the physical world is there because it is a manifestation of psychophysically neutral archetypes. A very crazy idea, but this is how Pauli and Jung was thinking. And it's also an interesting, it allows us to put up a very interesting response to a question that one of the greatest mathematical physicists of the 20th century raised, Eugene Wigner. Wigner had this paper on which had the title, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. So if we have this correlation, this sigma 3 correlation between the psychophysically neutral mathematics and the physical world and the chemical world and so on, that would be the natural sciences. If we have this correlation, then the effectiveness of mathematics in these sciences is not at all unreasonable. It's not miraculous. It is wonderful, but it's not miraculous. So that's about the deep correlations. Now, I still have some time, that's good. These are the deep correlations from the psychophysically neutral into the aspects. Now, the surface correlations, and that's something that really leads us into a domain of empirical work that can be carried out in order to support the whole framework. In the surface correlations, we have the correlations really between the mental and the physical, psychophysical correlations. And there are some of them that are structural and persistent, like neural correlates of consciousness or psychosomatic relations. For instance, I put you under pressure and then of course your blood pressure goes up. That's a very stable correlation, which is structural. And then there are other ones that we call induced or occasional, which are not stable. They are not reproducible, as you see here. They are evasive. And we can use this kind of dichotomy of different types of correlations to build up a kind of baseline correlation for the structural psychophysical correlations, the stable ones. And then the induced correlations deviate from that baseline. This is purely conceptual development. Now, we can have positive and negative deviations, of course, from the baseline. Positive deviations we call excess correlations. These are experiences of coincidence. So more correlations than you usually expect, excess correlations. And you can have deficit correlations, experiences of dissociation. So you experience less correlations than you would usually expect in a, let me say, in a standard reality model of humans. Both of these types of correlations are experienced as meaningful because they deviate from the baseline. I mean, just the fact that they deviate lets us draw attention to them. So the baseline of ordinary correlations between self-model and world model. And so what some people like Jung called numinous experiences or once in a lifetime experiences, whatever, that would be an extreme deviation. And in the ordinary case, we're just sitting at the baseline and have no deviation at all, right? So this is a kind of taxonomy of different phenomena that derive actually from the dual aspect model that I presented to you so far. We have deviations in the self model, we have deviations in the world model. And then we also have, and that's the main point of what I was discussing so far, we also have deviations in the relations between self-model and world model. So in coincidence phenomena, we have a connection of ordinarily disconnected elements of self-model and world model. And in dissociation phenomena, we have a disconnection of ordinarily connected elements of self-model and world model. So a very good example for this type of phenomena would be out-of-body experiences, which are by now studied in several labs worldwide. And coincidence phenomena are phenomena like what Jung actually suggested as synchronicities, phenomena which connect certain mental states with some physical states. Physical states can be shown in a totally veridical way, and then they have to be related to the mental connections. And then if the subject that has this mental representation, the mental state, if the subject relates this mental state to an event in the physical world, then it usually has this experience of meaningfulness, of sensefulness. There are many examples of that. Now I want to show you a little bit of empirical material that we collected in collaboration with an institute for frontier areas of psychology at Freiburg. This is an institute which has in one of its departments that they have a counseling and information service for people who experience these exceptional experiences like these phenomena that I just mentioned. And by now, I mean, this is an old number now, it's almost 3,000, I guess. Reports of such experience have been collected and documented, and also documented with questionnaires. so there is a very rich, huge body of empirical material that can be systematically investigated. And I should mention here that what we investigate is really the phenomenology of these experiences, the way in which people describe what they experienced. Then you can apply all these, the usual torture instruments of psychology and other sciences, cognitive science. And the analyses, all the analyses that we did so far, remember, almost 3,000 cases, that's 3,000 cases, and compare that with what's usually called sufficient in psychophysiology experiments, where you have 20 or 25 subjects. So we really have, it's astounding. So all these analyses that we performed here support the 4-pattern classification or taxonomy suggested by the dual aspect model. Distribution over patterns is comparable for different subsamples. We have different subsamples in these 3,000 or 2,300 cases here. And we can also do, meanwhile, we can also do psychophysical studies in the lab studies, which allow us to identify individuals with coincidence and dissociation disposition, and then compare that with the questionnaire that they had to fill. So we can do a lot of interesting work here. These are several PhD theses that have been done at the Collegium Helveticum, where I was before I went into retirement, and also in collaboration with the Psychiatric University Clinic in Zurich. Now, in this slide here, I want to show you, and that's almost the final slide. I think I should be ready in 3 or 5 minutes. So this is a compact representation of several subsamples of all these 3,000 cases coming from different sources. So you see these 6 different groups of different subsamples here. These IGPP means this is the drawn line here, which you see like here. See here. This is people looking for advice at this Freiburg Institute. These people, the dashed line, are near-death experience people who experienced a near-death experience in the past. These are experienced meditators, the dotted line. This is another dashed line, which are students from a German university. This is a small dashed line. This is a study with 1,800 people from a Swiss online study. And this is finally a study from the University of West Georgia, I think, if I remember correctly. That's from the US. That's from the US, exactly, yes. And what you see here is this 4-pattern taxonomy, again, external, internal, coincidence, and dissociation. And here you see the ratings in the documentation system, how intense the experience. I'm sorry, no, this is not intensity, this is frequency. How frequent people in these different subgroups experienced phenomena like external, coincidence, internal, and dissociation. So what you see is that the dashed line here, this is the people with a past, with a near-death experience. These are by far the most frequent, right? You can see that here. And when you go, for instance, into the inner side of this graph here, you see this dashed line here. This would be the Swiss online study. That's just general population, and you wouldn't expect that they have in the general population that you see these experiences very frequently. So it's exactly almost like a meeting the expectation, not only meeting the taxonomy, also meeting the expectation. So the other very high frequency group here is the dotted line going down here. That would be people with a lot of meditative practice. Another line which is relatively high in frequency, that's the drawn line, the solid line here. That's people looking for advice at the Freiburg Institute. So these people obviously must have had exceptional experience, otherwise they wouldn't have come for advice. So that's a very nice confirmation of the of one of the predictions that dual aspect monism makes, namely frequency and also intensity, which is not shown here, of exceptional experiences of different kinds. Now, let's see, where am I here? Oops, what comes next? Yes. So this is almost the end of the presentation. It's always nice to end with something that is empirical when you are coming this very long way from philosophy or quantum mechanics and so on. But now what I want to show you finally in the final slide is the answer to a question that many of you might already have. So the question is, this is all nice and interesting and all these taxonomy issues and so on and so on. But what, you know, talking about this psychophysically neutral, what is in there? What is it? How can we better understand what that is? Something that's neither mental nor physical. And here I have I have been asked that question so many times that I came up finally with a list of different possibilities to approach what psychophysical neutrality could really mean. And here you have the list. Of course, Spinoza, if you go back all the way to Spinoza, for Spinoza, the neither mental nor physical is the divine and its attributes, infinite and eternal. That doesn't help us a lot, but I just wanted to include this in the list because that's how far you can go when you really talk about the psychophysically neutral domain. Then when you look into the work of famous mathematicians like Kurt Gödel, Ernst Specker, that's the Specker of the Cogent-Specker theorem, or look into Roger Penrose's work, look into Alarcon and others. All these people insist that mathematical objects are not designed by the human brain or by human intuition or something. They are existing in another world, in a world which is neither mental nor physical. So they would be talking about primordial mathematical objects. And they would say that the truth of mathematics is not what we invent. What we invent is provability, but truth is in the primordiality of the mathematical objects. And we try to show this truth by inventing methods of proving mathematical proof and so on. I will show you a very nice quote by one of these people, by Alarcon, in the next slide. When Kant was talking about the conditions for the possibility of experience, obviously he was talking about something that is prior to this experience, conditions for the possibility of it. So he was talking about something that is not mental and not physical, Many of you may know the work of J.J. Gibson, ecological psychology. If you look into Gibson's notion of affordances and the action perception link and something like that, then the affordance is something that affords action and perception. So it's prior to action and perception. Perception is something about the external world, the physical. Perception is something that which happens in your mental domain. And when you link it to action that follows from the perception, for instance, then action is something that happens in the physical world. So the action perception link is something that is based on the affordances, and the affordances therefore are something that is neither outside nor inside, neither mental nor physical. So Jung, that I mentioned that already, Jung talks about archetypes, which are neither mental nor physical, unconscious ordering factors. Marcus Gabriel, with whom we are now doing a lot of work on meaning, talks about a sense field ontology, which is the psychophysically neutral, and fields of meaning are part of this kind of sense field ontology. That would be something in the sense of sigma 2 and sigma 3, not the surface correlations, but the deep correlations. And to come up with something that not many of you may know, I don't know about some of you, Joseph Beuys was an artist and also a philosopher in the 20th century in the Academy of Arts in Düsseldorf in Germany. And he invented this, I misspelled this, yes, this notion of the social sculpture. And the social sculpture in Beuys is something which he showed in pieces of art that he called actions. For instance, you may have heard about this famous action in New York in one of the art institutes in New York City. And the title was, I like America and America likes me. And this was an action in which he put himself into a sealed room, which had walls through which you could look from glass, out of glass. So he was the designer of the action, but he also was, so the subject, but he was also the object of the action, because he put himself into this room together with the coyote. And then what happened was amazing. There were visitors every day. They didn't know what would happen, and nobody knew what happened. But this was a very nice demonstration of undercutting the subject-object distinction from an artistic point of view. Now, finally, the quotation that I promised you by Alain Kohn, Grand Master of non-commutative algebra and geometry, and he has done a lot of work on non-commutative structures in physics, and also, of course, in mathematics. And here's what he says in a kind of conversation with two other mathematicians. I maintain that mathematics has an object that is just as real as that of the sciences, but this object is not material, and it is located in neither space nor time. Nevertheless, this object has an existence that is every bit as solid as external reality, and mathematicians bump up against it in somewhat the same way as one bumps up into a material object in external reality. Because this reality cannot be located in space and time, it affords, now again, the notion of affordance, it affords, when one is fortunate enough to uncover the minutest portion of it, a sensation of extraordinary pleasure through the feeling of timelessness that it produces. Wonderful quotation, I think. Brief summary, and then I'm done. Dual aspect monism considers the mental M and the physical P as dual aspects of an underlying psychophysical and neutral whole, PPN. Meaning plays an essential role in the fabric of reality. As sense, that's the deep structure involving the psychophysically neutral, and as reference, or intentionality, which refers to the surface structure relating M to P. There are two types of MP correlations. These are the surface correlations. Persistent reproducible, these are ordinary structural baseline correlations, and the other one, occasional evasive. These are induced deviations above and below the baseline. We have a systematic taxonomy of these correlations that actually can be constructed from details of the dual aspect monist picture. And this taxonomy is empirically supported by phenomenological studies of exceptional experiences. Okay. To be continued. At this, maybe we had a long discussion when we published this book that I showed you before, this one here, and we wanted to put something, on the front page, a nice motto for the book. And I think this is a good one. Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. T.S. Eliot. And here's the book again, the title. And this is another book that is already a few years old. And this is a nice indication of a collaboration that I also have with Christopher Fuchs here, Chris Fuchs, who will be the next speaker in your program. So it's a kind of indirect introduction. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Harald. That was fascinating. So we've got about a half an hour for Q&A. And it looks like most people were sending questions in through the chat. And so in future, if you could send questions through the Q&A, I think that'll work better. But so now Michael, I believe, is the moderator, and he's going to look at the questions and read them and then pose them to Harald, and then he'll be in charge from now on for a little while. Okay. Michael.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, very good. So let's start. So everyone, please submit your questions into the Q&A book. So we already have a couple of them. So let's start with these, and I have a ton.
So Michael, I have a question first. Should I go out of the sharing mode, or?
No, you can just stay. Yeah, okay. I mean, if you can see the question, would be helpful, of course, for you to read, but I will read them.
Questions are in the F&A. Yes, I have it here. Okay.
Yeah, but remain please in the so that we can see your slides. So
Okay.
okay.
Yes.
So Shmuel
Yerushalmi, yes.
Yerushalmi is asking question to Harald. I want to ask you, is it we can use monism theory for understanding and research social processes as social inequality, poverty, social and economic disparities. So what are the implications for the social world from your theory?
I'm optimistic, so my answer is always yes. But I haven't seen, I have seen a lot of applications which are more in the spirit of applying the mathematics of quantum theory to social science itself. But I haven't seen work on which really uses the structure of quantum theory for this picture. This is a broader picture, right? And so in the dual aspect monist picture, quantum cognition would fit into the M part. Quantum mechanics proper would fit into the P part. Now we have a much broader picture, and I'm not sure. I could imagine that, I haven't thought about that before, but I could imagine that if you have interesting correlations, even in social processes between the mental system of maybe even groups of people, not individuals, but groups of people, and their physical environment, something like that, this might be an arena where, you know, this question could be targeted, but I haven't seen concrete work so far.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the picture is so broad that I would assume, you know, at the end of the day, there will be application almost everywhere.
Yeah. Well, this also goes into the direction of collective consciousness, I guess, and what can be said about
Collective
this?
consciousness, yes, exactly, exactly, yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is good when this workshop can trigger new questions.
That's
so
the best.
we will ask you next year. Okay, let's go to the next question. Stefano Calzati is asking about the psychophysical correlations. What is meant by meaning? Is there a value-based configuration? Is this a value-based configuration, an affordance-dependent design, or is it a substance or something else? So what is meaning in ontological?
Yeah, I would say meaning, usually meaning is considered to be a relational notion between something that means and something that is meant, right? That would be, I think the easiest way to embed that into an existing theoretical structure would be semiotics developed by Peirce and also others. So I don't think that value is already in principle part of meaning in the sense of semiotics, but of course, for instance, when you talk about mental representations, I mentioned that you can have phenomenal content and you can also have intentional content. The intentional content would be that gives us the meaning of the representation. Some people now also come up to say that there should be a third type of content in representations, which can neither be classified as phenomenal nor as intentional. That would be values. That's a new direction in the philosophy of mind, but that would mean that the orientation toward values plays an extra role, an additional role. And that's not the same as meaning in the sense that, for instance, people like Mentano use it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also had a question in this context. I have to say I'm a Buddhist, so I look at these things also from a bit different angle. So, and there the question would be, whenever there's meaning, there's always a self, like meaning for whom. There must be a subject introduced. Otherwise, meaning can meaning just float in the air on its own. Can you comment on this?
Yeah. So the surface correlations that we are treating are relations between the mental representations of someone who has a self model. So you would say, who has a self maybe, and something that is not part of that self model, and some people call that the world model, something like that, external reality. But now there's a very interesting critical twist on that kind of situation in dual aspect monism, because when you go from the aspects, from the mental and the physical, back into their ground, the psychophysically neutral, then the self and world distinction dissolves. In that sense, when you have an experience in the sense of between M and PPN, let's say, then this cannot be an experience really which is purely mental or purely driven by a subject. If the subject-object distinction dissolves, then it becomes a very interesting question: who experiences the meaning?
Exactly.
And some people, you know, the step before you dissolve the subject-object distinction in Buddhism is often called witness consciousness. Then you are still witnessing, yourself is somehow still witnessing something. But finally, this distinction has to go too. And then there's no witness anymore. Then there's only just, some people call it pure presence, or William James, by the way, called it pure experience. That is, or some other people call it non-dual awareness.
Yes.
Which that's a notion that you of course know. Thomas Metzinger calls it minimal phenomenal experience. Depending on from where you come, there are different notions you can approach this question, but this is a very, very deep question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's continue. Can dual aspect monist ontologies be understood as dialectical? What might this mean for social theory? I mean, part of it you have already answered, or not?
Yeah, dialectical. I mean, I mentioned already that Schelling, the philosopher Schelling, is often misinterpreted as an idealist, as an objective idealist. The late Schelling certainly not. And the same, Marcus Gabriel, for instance, in the University of Bonn, he argues, he has a very nice paper that has the title, "What kind of idealist, if any, is Hegel?" So Marcus doubts that even Hegel, the godfather of dialectics in a way, is actually an idealist. So I have to admit that I didn't study Hegel well enough to be able to be put in a situation that I can answer this kind of dialectics question. This is another interesting project, I would say. I can't, so I have to pause on it. Good question.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
Lisette Lorenz is asking, what are some examples of exceptional experiences? How are they related to non-ordinary states of consciousness, for example, meditative or trance states, psychedelic experiences, psychosis, and so on?
That's right. Yeah. So I can say this: the empirical material that we collected is only spontaneous experiences, not induced experiences. So we did not study exceptional experiences induced by psychoactive drugs or by the samadhi tank or whatever. Yeah, that's one point. The other point is that when you talk to your subjects which have these experiences, then of course you must really be sure that there's no psychosis involved, because then they definitely need treatment and no questionnaires, right? So these are two cases which are not part of our empirical base. Now, what are some examples of exceptional experiences? One I mentioned already. In dissociation, we can have out-of-body experiences. We can also have what is known as sleep paralysis. So some people experience that waking up, and they still have this feeling of not being in control over their limbs and whatever, they cannot move. This is a paralysis which comes out of the sleep state and is still experienced in the hypnagogic state. Then synchronistic experiences, like what Jung was very much up to. For instance, like there's this famous case of Elizabeth Crone. She wrote a whole book about it, I think. She was living in Houston, was struck by lightning, and after that lightning experience, of course, then she was in the hospital, and coming out of the hospital, she had this this strange kind of talent. She didn't experience it as a talent, but it is a kind of talent to be able to predict things that would happen maybe one or 2 days later, although there was no indication, there was no causal chain to them. Like, for instance, there was this famous accident, the crash of this airplane on the Hudson River. You may remember that years ago. And she saw that in a kind of one of her trance states the day before it happened. And she didn't describe it as a plane crash. She described it as something sitting in the water with 2 wings. And there were many people standing on the wings or something like that. She didn't know it was a plane crash because it was the day before, right? And then the next day she watched the newspaper and saw exactly what she had seen as a picture the day before. So that would be a kind of a relation, an exceptional experience in the sense that she had a mental state, a mental representation of something that she actually didn't really understand when she had it. And only the next day when she saw the picture in the newspaper, she saw, and then she realized this was an event in the physical world. And of course, her experience with that event, where then when she saw it in the newspaper was coupled by meaning, right? Then she would say, now I understand what I saw, although of course she didn't understand how it happened, of course, right? But this would be a kind of typical coincidence experience like that.
Thank you. This brings me to one question I also had about time. It seems that this PPN is a hidden reality, but and time only emerges when it's projected into this mental physical. That entanglement is more fundamental, and then entanglement, when time comes into being, the entanglement is replaced by causality or something like this. But so, can you comment on this?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Kant was still talking about, when he talked about the conditions for the possibility of experience, he had these synthetic judgment a priori. He would say experience is impossible without time, space, and causation was the third, right? So he would say these are the conditions for the possibility of experience. Now we would say this is not, today we know this is not the case. In physics, we know this is not the case. Because time and space are something that emerges somehow, as you say, by just projecting into the mental and the physical. You can come up with some notion of time. And in this book that I mentioned before, it's just here, Dual Aspect Monism, we have one chapter on the emergence of time, because that's a big issue in all these attempts to come up with coherent theories of quantum gravity.
Okay.
So even in physics, we have this problem that we know that time has to come from somewhere. In physics, it's not really clear where it comes from. In dual aspect monism, conceptually, we know where it comes from, but of course, we cannot really derive it formally.
Okay, let's continue. Somebody asks, is it too simplified to say that matter is an exteriorized expression of mental phenomena that are experienced as internal, thus making the mental the unconscious realm, which becomes conscious when expressed as material space-time phenomena?
That would be the idealist response, I would say, or it sounds like the idealist response. No, I would say matter and mind are exteriorized, if you want to use that term, of the psychophysically neutral.
But there may be a comment, if they are, aren't they in a sense mirror symmetric in some sense, because they are derived from the same source?
Yes, the mental and the physical have, so cum grano salis, I would always say, when someone wants to argue idealism is more viable than physicalism, or the other way around, I would say they are equally, unviable in a sense, exactly because what you said, they're mirror images in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't make sense. If you want to argue against physicalism and turn to the idealist camp, then you are just doing the same from the others, from the perspective of the mirror image. So that won't help.
Thank you. Irfan is asking, can quantum theory be used for political deliberation research? Political deliberation is based on arguments intended to reach a consensus. If possible, please share some literature for further reading.
I think Alex mentioned one of these, one direction of research which addresses that. When Alex, when you mentioned this name, Michael Murphy, right? That would be a kind of quantum approaches in international relations. And that I could imagine, I haven't studied that myself. Yeah. That might be a direction to go, I think.
Yeah, it was more a general question. So now I will mispronounce the name, Zrinka Stimac. Thank you very much for this broad picture that could help to analyze questions in disciplines dealing with different religions and religious phenomena. Also, when dealing with convergences and divergences between different knowledge systems, holistic. Okay, it's more a comment, right? Yeah.
It's a comment, but it is. I can't approve of that.
Yeah. Okay, then Nick Vincent is asking, would you clarify regarding the Kant-Schopenhauer debate, how does panpsychism and cosmopsychism differ from dual aspect monism? Is it that panpsychism and cosmopsychism are, in a manner of speaking, psychophysical but not neutral?
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it, actually. My way to answer this question usually is, in panpsychism, you have a domain in which everything that is material is also mental, also has mental properties. So you have both mental and physical properties. In dual aspect monism, you have a domain in which there's neither mental nor physical. So that's, to put it very simply, that's the main difference. And then panpsychism and cosmopsychism differ in the same way from, or in a similar way from one another as neutral monism and dual aspect monism differ. Because, I mentioned at the beginning, neutral monism is compositional. Our dual aspect monism is decompositional. Panpsychism is compositional. Cosmopsychism is decompositional. You have cosmopsychism, like what Philip Goff does. You have the whole universe as the primary ground for your argument, and the whole universe has, of course, physical properties, but you also have this what they call universal consciousness, and that gets broken down into smaller systems, individuals, and so on. In panpsychism, you have every single entity, every atom, every electron, whatever, which of course has material properties, also is assumed to have something like mental properties, proto-mental maybe, or proto-experiential. So panpsychism would be compositional, and then you get the combination problem. While in cosmopsychism, you do the opposite. You start with one big system and then split it down into parts.
Okay, so please, if there's more, okay.
I have a question. Can I cut in?
Sure.
Yeah, just two thoughts, Harald. First of all, this kind of goes back, I think, to the very first question. I'm struck by the fact that the empirical examples you have are all anomalous, unusual phenomena. And for most social scientists, we're not studying anything particularly unusual or anything, at least not anything metaphysically unusual and so on. So we're studying norms and institutions, politics, whatever it is. So I wonder why the empirical thrust of your argument heads in this direction that's kind of very exotic in a way, and the more banal kind of generic social science is kind of left behind. So I guess I'm wondering whether your argument speaks to questions about social structure or whatever. So that's kind of echoing a couple of the comments. But the other comment I wanted to make is on the political deliberation research question. To my knowledge, I haven't seen anything specifically on deliberation and political deliberation in particular. But I think quantum theory or quantum social science can be applied to anything. So the answer would be yes, it could be applied to that. And I think that the difference, or what would be the novel contribution, would be how you model the decision makers that are going to be engaging in deliberation. You know, they're going to have preferences that are not well defined. They're going to have beliefs that are not well defined. And all the quantum effects are going to emerge through the context of deliberation and interaction. So it would be a very different picture. And I think that empirically, that presumably would have different predictions and so on too. So I think that'd be a very interesting direction to go, but I'm not aware of anything that specifically addresses that issue. So anyway, that's just my 2 comments, questions, or whatever.
Yeah. So yeah, I can just respond what comes to my mind, right? So the question, why do we take these exotic phenomena? That is a little bit of, it just happened that we had in this Freiburg Institute, we have this pool of documented experiences. And then we thought this might be a nice test case for those correlations that deviate from the baseline. Of course, we can also say a lot about those correlations that do not deviate from the baseline, but are the baseline, form the baseline. And these are not the exotic correlations. And for those correlations that are the baseline correlations, these correlations are, of course, scientifically, in a sense, more interesting because they are reproducible or quasi-reproducible, right? And the examples that I mentioned were just of psychophysiological correlations, but I could imagine psychosocial correlations in a broader framework too. And the only thing is I'm not an expert on that, so that might require some more thinking to come up with that. Like, for instance, what is a good example? Group consciousness, I'm not sure. Is that something you would be willing to talk about in political science?
It'd be very controversial to use the phrase group or collective consciousness, but I'm personally very attracted, and I've always thought that quantum theory could speak to that, but it's a tricky argument to make.
So, but just very vaguely speaking, that might be a direction in which this dual aspect picture would work, because nobody really understands. But let me put it another way. Everybody talks about neural correlates of consciousness in neuroscience and in the philosophy of mind as well. And then they talk about how stable are they, and are they one-to-one, are they one-to-many, are they many-to-many, and all this kind of stuff. But nobody asks really the question, where do they come from? What's the reason why they are there? And this question is addressed by this dual aspect monist picture, because in typical talk about neural correlates of consciousness, you have a bipartite picture. You just have the mental and the physical, and then you relate them. We have a tripartite picture. We have the mental, the physical, and the ground from which they are driven. And the ground from which they are driven not only drives the mental and the physical, it also drives correlations between them in a very natural way. So that's a very natural explanation for any kind of psychophysical, psychosocial, whatever correlations. And of course, that is far too general to make concrete predictions. So that has to be formulated in a way that you can really apply to let's say, contexts that you can have under control to make experiments or something. But that's certainly something where I see potential.
Okay. We have another question in the Q&A, but Joyce wanted to ask a question because it's apparently participants in the panel cannot type in questions. Maybe, Kelly, we can change this. Okay, Joyce, just go ahead.
We can go ahead with Andrew's question first.
Okay.
Don't want to cut the line.
It's fine. We don't have so many.
Okay. Maybe I can quickly follow them, because I think, thank you so much, Harald.
Hi, Joyce.
Always lovely and very inspiring work. Like I need 200 years life to be able to explore. I want to, maybe I have so many things, and I already ordered your book right away, of course. And I just want to maybe have a follow-up, like even some just chatting the possibility about you open up so many opportunities for exploring like this maybe surface correlation you mentioned, like even just follow up with the very interesting example you showed here. I wonder whether it's possible, for example, with the now the large data we have on the network, like machine learning of the large content, chat, social media comments from different culture, from different society groups, and so on, maybe different religions, like some people mentioned here in the comments.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to see, like, for example, as you mentioned, the baseline difference. Then we can come up with some model and see how the self model, word model different. But I think this require a lot of work, of course.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Coding, like I'd love to read the empirical studies you mentioned here, how to even code the different four cases. I wonder whether that could be a case. But my question is also wants to get your take on, is it fair to say that from your current perspective, that the deep correlations, the two deep correlations, probably very hard to study empirically. So they really just have to stay as a pullback metaphor.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because that's something that I'm currently very much interested in myself, because I mentioned these decomposition classes. Remember this? The two decomposition classes in the tripartite version. And yes, there is an isomorphism between the Greenberger Horn-Zeilinger states, the GHZ states, and the Borromean rings. This is a topological structure which is called a knot structure. And the Borromean rings are isomorphic to the GHZ state. Now, the Borromean rings themselves are isomorphic to structures that people are now very recently beginning to study in number theory. And these objects are called triples of primes, and they are very abstract entities. This is a theory that goes all the way back to Carl Friedrich Gauss. And so what I'm now studying, trying to study, is really the isomorphism between knots and primes in order to understand the psychophysically neutral in relation to the mental and the physical in a better way, in a more formal way, in a way which is nowhere existing in present-day quantum mechanics. This is really, by now, it's pure math. And, you know, at the University of Bonn, there is this Fields Medal winner of 2018 or 19. And he is working in this field. It's now called arithmetic topology. And I asked him the question, do you have any application for your arithmetic topology, this primes and knots thing, right? This relation. And he said, no way, no, I don't see any. And then I said to him, look at this picture, the dual aspect, that this is exactly what I think might be a kind of philosophical application. Of course, not a physical, it's much broader. A philosophical application which might really profit from a better understanding of this primes and knots relation. So that's something I'm right now very much interested in, and I'm a little bit on fire with it.
It's so exciting, and looking forward to hear more about it. But this is just so much to think. I think that's the purpose exactly for the workshop, and to provoke everyone, inspire everyone to to explore this from different domains. Thank you so much, Harald. I'll make sure I'll give you a chance to talk.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, let's continue with the question.
About 5 minutes left. So.
Yeah. So Andrew Milner has a question. Are mind and matter complementary in dual aspect monism ontologies? Might Taoist dialectical thought support a dual aspect monist ontology?
Yeah, so the first question, I can say that Pauli and Jung actually were very much interested in looking for this complementarity version, right? So Pauli, there's many quotes by Pauli in which he says, when he says, you know, when you look at a system in terms of its physical properties, then you have to disregard the mental and vice versa. So that would be a feature of complementarity, right? Now, Eastern thinking is I think it's very closely, not Eastern thinking in general, but certain streams in Eastern thinking are very closely related to dual aspect monism. Now, I am in the board of trustees of a number of Zen centers in the United States and also in Europe, and these people, you know, I could travel every week into one of these centers to give talks there, because they really see that there's a lot in their thinking which corresponds to this picture here. And of course, the most interesting part is where friction arises, of course, right? But not only Taoist, also Buddhist, and there's some, for instance, very closely related to dual aspect ontology is Advaita Vedanta, I would say. Maybe that's the closest. While, for instance, the Yoga Sutra by Patanjali, this is the Patanjali line, this is more like an objective idealism kind of thinking, universal consciousness, you know, this kind of stuff. So some of these Eastern systems are close and others are not. And then you have to look into the details.
Yeah. Will you join the open discussion later? Or
is that at 1 o'clock, or when was it?
Yeah, it will be after Chris.
1 o'clock. That would be 7 my time. I can't. This is 1 hour?
Yeah.
It's 1 hour. I will try. Okay.
Because I would like to follow up on intentionality, and like in Buddhism, what I understand is very similar, but the key also what distinguishes Buddhism from other non-dual approaches is the understanding of cause and effect, and of intentionality and volition. So I would be curious to.
Let me just say one thing, and just by way of a little caveat. You know, when I say intentionality, I use the technical term which derives from Brentano. And intentionality in Brentano's sense has nothing to do with what we call intention, like the intention to do something or so. Mm-hmm. It's very different. And I think that in some of the Buddhist systems, intention is central, but not Brentano's intentionality. Is that right?
Maybe. Intention always is linked to a self. But intentionality, the way I hear you, still pushes things into motion, which also in Buddhism is important.
Oh, that's exactly not the case in Brentano's. In Brentano's version, intentionality is just a reference relation, period. Nothing else.
Okay, good. We have 1 more minute for Matt's question about, he's asking about implications of what you presented to Karen Barat's agential.
Yeah, no, yeah, but I can't really answer that. I'm sorry. I didn't study Barat stuff well enough. I just have very superficial knowledge. I could say agential realism, yes, but this doesn't help, you know.
Okay. Thank you. And 1 last minute. So the same question, is there any connection to John Dewey's theory of experience?
Yes, John Dewey is one of the American pragmatists, as William James was, of course. And John Dewey's theory of experience is probably inspired by William James. And since William James was a representative of neutral monism, John Dewey probably also was one. So there is a relation. I'm not familiar enough with John Dewey's ideas in detail, but I would say it's a worthwhile object of study. I mean, it's certainly interesting to work that out in more detail.
I could just add to that actually a later book that Dewey did with Bentley, a transactional theory of action, that conception of action, I always thought had very strong parallels with what a quantum view of action would be. So I think there's a direct, and they don't talk about quantum theory.
No, yeah.
It's a process-oriented view. It's very simpatico, I think. So
okay, that sounds interesting, yeah.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our allotted time, and we need a 15-minute break, but that was really terrific opening, Harald, and thank you very much for coming, and hopefully you can join the 1 o'clock session. And
yeah, I will try. That would be 7 o'clock my time, I think. Yes. I think I can.
So,
I think I
yes.
can do that.
So we will take a 15-minute break, and then we'll be back and talking to Christopher Fuchs. So
Is can I just ask one final question? Is
sure.
the same Zoom link for the 1 o'clock thing?
Kelly knows the answer to that question.
So if it's not, then Kelly might send me another Zoom link for 1 o'clock.
I'll remind you all, the next session, Christopher Fuchs's session, is on this same link. This link will remain open for everyone. I'm not going to close it out.
Okay.
The afternoon sessions, there are 2 concurrent sessions today. One of them will be on this link, which we will convert to a meeting instead of a webinar. So it will need to be closed out and then reopened, but it's the same link. And then the math tutorial will be a separate link that is available on the schedule website. I sent that in the chat to everyone. So those 2 links will be the only 2 we're using this week. Hope that was.
So the one for 1 o'clock is the same that I'm using now.
I'm not sure what your time zone is, but.
I believe so. So the one for the open discussion will be converted to meeting.
Yes.
And it will be the same, as far as I understand, it will be the same as currently. Otherwise, we will send you another link.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks. So see you in what is it? 2 hours.
All right. Well, thank you, Harald, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody else in about 15 minutes.
I just want to maybe have a tip. I think our staff members have nicely added the 2 Zoom links for the afternoon and for the morning on the website, just in case you close your Zoom and lost the chat or whatever content there. So you can always go to the schedule website and see the links.
Okay.
Yes, and I just saw that it's not the same link. So maybe everyone who would like to join the open discussion, please go onto our webpage and then just click on open discussion. It's a link to Zoom. So, and then you will be all set.